Hey students, this is Dr. Spellman, and in this video we're going to talk about the beginning of Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is titled Anthropocentrism, Ratiocentrism, and Indirect Duties. And in this video we're going to focus on that first topic, anthropocentrism. All right, so this distinction that I have on the screen here is between instrumental value and intrinsic or inherent value. So this maybe isn't from Chapter 5, I guess Chapter 5 talks about it a little bit, but I think this distinction is going to be really important as we dive into the material further, so I wanted to start with it. Okay, so Chapter 5 is interested in this question: what is directly morally considerable? And in order to know what's directly morally considerable, I think it's asking a question about what has intrinsic or inherent value, what's valuable for its own sake that we need to take into consideration. So it'll be helpful to distinguish that from instrumental value. Okay, what's instrumental value? A thing has instrumental value if and only if it's valuable for the sake of something else. So I think most things that are around us have instrumental value. We use them to do other things. So if I'm looking around me, I see some pencils. Pencils we don't think of as having intrinsic value. We think that they have instrumental value. We use them to write with or communicate our ideas. That'd be an example of something that has instrumental value. Intrinsic or inherent value is something had by things that are valuable for their own sake. So that idea that things that are intrinsic or inherently valuable are valuable for the sake, for their own sake, not for the sake of something else. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that a pencil's intrinsically or inherently valuable. It's useful, sure, but if I destroyed the pencil, crushed it into little bits, that would be fine. So that makes me think that the pencil is not something with intrinsic or inherent value. Instrumental value, so we're sort of jumping back and forth here. Instrumental value comes from what a thing produces, or what comes out of it. What can it get for us? Whereas, I guess I'm not going back over. The amount of instrumental value that a thing has depends on what it produces and how efficiently it can produce that sort of thing. So, right, we might think $500 is more instrumentally valuable than $50, right? Why? Because it can produce more stuff. It can buy me more things. As far as efficiency goes, I'm trying to think of what's a good example? Maybe like access to the internet versus a thesaurus. The thought is well, the internet, it's maybe easier to navigate. It can give me more information. Maybe it can get it faster than a thesaurus could. It would take me longer. Thesaurus? Why am I talking about thesaurus? Like an encyclopedia or something like that. Encyclopedia, maybe it has a lot of the same information, but it's going to take longer to get it. So maybe it's not as instrumentally valuable as the internet. Intrinsic or inherent value comes from what a thing is. So the value of something that's intrinsically or inherently valuable isn't a function of its usefulness. Some things we might just think are more valuable than others sort of on their own. Maybe we'll get a better sense for this when we look at examples. So turning to examples, sorry, it's covered up a little bit by my picture there maybe. So examples include chocolate. That would be instrumentally valuable. I don't know, is chocolate inherently valuable? I'm not really sure, but it's really tasty to eat. So it gets me pleasure, and that maybe we think the pleasure is intrinsically or inherently valuable, but the chocolate is instrumentally valuable insofar as it gives me the pleasure or happiness. Clothes, also instrumentally valuable. Like we could have lived maybe in a society or something like that where nobody wore clothes. That'd be kind of weird. I don't know. But the idea is that clothes are mainly of instrumental value for looking fashionable, looking stylish, also keeping warm, those sorts of things. So the clothes aren't valuable in and of themselves. They're valuable for other things. And then money, That's the other one that's being hidden there. Money is a classically instrumentally valuable thing. We don't really value the money for its own sake. We value it for the sake of what it can get us. Whereas examples of intrinsic or inherent value, something like happiness or pleasure, some people think those are the things that are inherently valuable. We do almost everything we do for the sake of happiness or pleasure. We'll talk about this view later called hedonism, um, that says that pleasure or happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically good. Other people maybe think rightly that like people have inherent value. So the thought here is that what's valuable isn't the reason people are valuable isn't that they can experience pleasure or happiness. It's just that like, no, people are valuable and they ought to be preserved regardless of what they can do for you. They have some sort of value for their own sake. All right. So now we'll move on to this question of what is moral considerability. So big question in this chapter, who or what is directly morally considerable? So we need to figure out what does it mean for something to be morally considerable in the first place. To say that something's morally considerable is to say that moral agents should take it into account when they're deciding what to do. So we've got two kinds of moral considerability, direct and indirect. Something is directly morally considerable if and only if moral agents should take it into account for its own sake, right? That sounds familiar, right? It's what we were talking about when we talked about intrinsic or inherent value. So the things that are directly morally considerable are the things that we need to pay attention to, not because of what they can get us, but because they themselves matter. And this is presumably true if we're like figuring out, a baby's drowning in a pond. Do we save it? The thought is like, oh, we like care about the baby for its own sake, even if the baby doesn't really do anything for us. If it's not our baby or something, we still think, wow, that's a valuable thing. We ought to save that baby. Again, maybe this is an idea that you could anticipate, but things that have objective, intrinsic, inherent value are going to be the kinds of things that are directly morally considerable. So this idea of objective value is not something we went over. Maybe it's not as important. This idea of intrinsic or inherent value is things that are indirectly morally considerable are the things that we should take into account for the sake of something else. So imagine that there's two things in a lake. There's a teddy bear and a baby. So before we said the baby has this like objective, intrinsic value, but the teddy bear, I think it has like indirect considerability. If no one cares about that teddy bear, then its being in the lake is kind of irrelevant. It doesn't really matter whether or not I don't know, the teddy bear drowns or something. It's in the lake. If no one cares about it, then there's nothing wrong with ignoring it. And certainly if there's like a baby and a teddy bear, the baby is the thing that's important to save. Now, if there's something, imagine somebody really cares about the teddy bear. Well, once somebody cares about it, then it's the kind of thing that we need to care about ourselves. So, like if little Jimmy, maybe there's not a baby in the lake, right? There's just a teddy bear floating, and the question is like, maybe there's an alligator by the pond or something. I don't know, maybe that's too too complicated of an example. Anyway, there's an alligator by the pond, so there's some danger in going in. If nobody cares about the teddy bear, just let it go. But if like little Jimmy is like, oh, I love that teddy bear, it's so important to me. If I don't get it, I'll die of sadness. Well, okay, now that teddy bear went from having like no value to having some value. It's morally considerable, but it's not directly morally considerable. It's indirectly morally considerable. We care about that teddy bear because little Jimmy, I think I said his name was, because Jimmy cares about it. Generally, things that are instrumentally valuable or subjectively valuable, those are the kinds of things that are indirectly morally considerable. We'll see this with some examples. Okay, so what is directly morally considerable? So not like what is direct moral considerability, but rather what sorts of things are directly morally considerable. There are a few different views here. So there's this kind of group of views that are individualist views that says individuals are the fundamental bearers of inherent value. So anthropocentrism is the view we're focused on, and that view says that all human beings have direct moral considerability. They are the fundamental bearers of inherent value. And anthropocentrism, well, we'll see that there are different versions, but they either say that humans are the only things that have value or that humans have more value than everything else. Ratiocentrism is slightly different. It says rational beings, that is adult humans, cognitively sophisticated space aliens, any being that's rational, maybe like some people might think dolphins or orangutans or whales, octopi, maybe some of those things are going to count as rational. So ratiocentrism says something like rational beings are the only things that have inherent value, or that rational beings have more inherent value than everything else, or are the only things that are directly morally considerable. Sentientism says that sentient beings are the things that are directly morally considerable. So that's all of the above: humans, space aliens, plus almost all animal species, since all animals are sentient. Almost all animals are sentient. Biocentrism, it's another individualist view. It says, well, not only those things we talked about above, but also plants, bivalves, right, that are sort of on the border, these animals that maybe aren't sentient, clams, oysters, mussels, scallops, plants, trees, shrubs, grass, all those sorts of things. Biocentrism says like all living things are directly morally considerable. So that exhausts sort of the individualist views. In the first unit of the course, we're going to focus on anthropocentrism, ratiocentrism, and sentientism. We'll talk about biocentrism later. Skip that. There are also some holist views. Again, we're going to get into these later in the semester, but they say that the things that we should care about aren't necessarily the individuals, but we should care about the collectives or groups. So ecocentrism says that species and ecosystems are the things that are directly morally considerable. Biocentric pluralism agrees with the ecocentrist that species and ecosystems are valuable, directly morally considerable, but they also think individuals are too. So the pluralist sort of says, well, the ecocentrists are right, but the individualists are right. Like all these things are directly morally considerable. Okay, it's a lot of buildup, but we finally made it to anthropocentrism. So anthropocentrism is a view here. We'll see in this little chart, like I'm saying, there's an area of ethics called normative ethics, and that's like sort of ethical theory. We're interested in what the right principles are. So we're not answering like specific questions like, is it okay to eat meat? We're answering some more general question about like, what things are okay to do? Give me a rule. And when we ask about moral considerability, we're asking like, what matters? What are the things that we should care about? Ethical theory is kind of like, how does it matter? So anthropocentrism is an individualist view. Okay, to try to motivate anthropocentrism a bit, we have this thought experiment. Imagine you're stranded on a lifeboat with an orangutan and a 2-year-old orphan. The lifeboat can only support 2 of you, so one of you must be sacrificed. So you're on that lifeboat. You're like, there's me, there's this orangutan, there's a 2-year-old. Who should I throw off? Are you going to throw yourself off? I don't know, probably not. You probably like living. So you've got this orangutan and the 2-year-old orphan. Which of them are you going to sacrifice? I think you should think about that question, right? What would you do? Um, and I don't know, maybe in class people say different things. Some people say, the orangutan. Some people say I'd sacrifice myself. Some people say the 2-year. People say different things, but you might think like, what is sort of the general view amongst our society? Who do you think, the vast majority of people, what do you think the vast majority would people do? And I think the answer, yeah, so here's the question. I think the answer there is that most people are going to sacrifice the orangutan, right? So reflection on this question about who we would sacrifice in this scenario makes us attracted to a kind of anthropocentrist view. Why is that? Well, the reason we chose to throw the orangutan off was because the orangutan isn't human. Notice that like the orangutan probably is smarter than the 2-year-old human. Like a 2-year-old human's good for basically nothing. They're actually not that instrumentally valuable. Of course, you might think like they're going to grow up to be someday. Maybe that affects the calculation. But in general, we kind of have this preference for animals of our own species, humans. And I think that's sort of what we're thinking about when we figure out who to throw off the lifeboat. Anthropocentrism kind of explains this. So strong anthropocentrism says a being has inherent value, or in other words, is directly morally considerable, if and only if that thing is human. So the thought here is like humans matter, orangutans don't. Orangutans maybe are instrumentally valuable. They might be cool to look at, or maybe they can generate revenue for our zoo, or that we can use them for certain purposes. But if we need to like throw something off of the lifeboat, the orangutan doesn't really matter. That's a kind of strong anthropocentrism. On this view, fetuses, this is maybe like controversial, but like fetuses, the thought is, are human, infants, adult humans, even humans in comas, all these, anything that's human, right, has inherent value, deserves a kind of consideration. Strong anthropocentrism is going to have problems that we'll point out shortly. Weak anthropocentrism is maybe more defensible. It says that a being has, not that it has to be human to have inherent value, but it's saying that a being has more inherent value than other things if and only if it's human. Or maybe another way to put this would be to say, if a being is human, then it has a kind of special, additional inherent value that other things don't have. Okay, is there anything else I wanted to say here? I don't think so. Okay, so it's uncontroversial, right, that humans have inherent value. I think that's uncontroversial. Humans are valuable. We shouldn't go around killing them, throwing them off of lifeboats, that sort of thing, for no good reason. We've got reasons to keep the humans around. But what, if anything, can explain why humans are the only beings who are directly morally considerable? Or why would humans be especially inherently valuable? Here the question is like, why did we throw that orangutan off? Why? What gave humans this sort of special status as being more valuable than orangutans? There are a bunch of different answers to this question. It might be worth trying to think for yourself, right, before you read all these answers, figuring out what do you think it is that makes humans especially valuable, more valuable than cats and dogs and dolphins and whales and goats, etc. Over the years, I've like collected answers from students. Here are some of them. Here are the things that people kind of point to say what makes humans special. One thought is that they agreed to abide by some shared social contract. So it's the agreement that gives them special value. Maybe it's their consciousness. Maybe it's their intelligence. Maybe it's that they're moral agents. That is, that they can think in moral terms, can ask moral questions, can act morally or immorally, the fact they have a conscience. Maybe it's the rationality. Maybe it's the fact they're the same species as us. Maybe it's the fact they can act freely. So on and so forth. They can think, understand, they have human DNA, they have souls, they look like us, we can empathize with them. God said so, they're made in God's image. All of these are potential answers to the question about what makes humans especially inherently valuable. The question is that we want to ask ourselves is like, does any of these answers work? Like, does it really do the job of explaining what makes humans deserving of more moral consideration than other animals? So if we're going to try and show that humans have a special inherent value, we'd have to show a couple things. One, we'd have to show that there's some feature that all and only humans have, like intelligence or something like that. We'd have to try and show that all humans have it and that only humans have it. We'd also have to show that that feature adds inherent value to things. So sort of like we'd want to show that whenever one thing is more intelligent than another thing, then the thing that has the intelligence is more inherently valuable. It's not obvious, though, that this is something that's possible to do. So there's sort of two kinds of problems. One is that if we're looking for things and we find something that all and only humans have, then we end up finding something that probably doesn't really seem to add any inherent value to things. So consider like human DNA, like all and only humans have human DNA. But what does human DNA make us special or like deserving of some extra moral status? I don't think so. That seems like a long shot. If, on the other hand, we find something that seems to add inherent value to things, it probably isn't something that all and only humans have. So something like consciousness or intelligence, that seems like the kind of thing that maybe could add value to something, maybe even inherent value. But then if we look around to look at humans, we might notice that, well, not all humans have that. So not all humans are intelligent, right? Some animals are more intelligent than some humans. And that's true even for some adult humans, right? Some adult humans are severely mentally disabled and are never going to be as cognitively sophisticated as certain animals. Does that mean that they are, less valuable than the animals? I don't know. That's a good question. We'd have to think long and hard about that. The intuitive answer, right? The answer we're sort of inclined to say is like, no, humans are always more valuable than animals, no matter what. But figuring out how to justify that view is going to be a bit tricky. Okay. So what I've tried to show or suggest is that we're going to have some difficulty defending a kind of anthropocentrist view, whether that's a strong version or a weak version. But there's some arguments as to why this might be right, and so it's worth spending a moment maybe looking at some of those arguments. One argument is this contractarian argument. So the contractarian argument says a being is directly morally considerable only if it has the capacity to participate in collective decision-making processes. The thought here is like, we have to care about other things only if it can kind of like collaborate with us and help us make decisions or come to some collective agreements. One idea here is sort of like, I have no moral duties to anybody unless I form an agreement with them. And so if that policy is true, or that sort of way of thinking about things is true, then this first premise looks plausible. Like, we only have to take into consideration those things that can make collective decisions with us. Premise 2 says that only humans have the capacity to participate in these collective decision-making processes. And the conclusion says, therefore, 3, only humans are going to be directly morally considerable. So we're going to learn about like constructing good arguments later on. And the thing I can tell you now is like, this argument is structurally good. That we call that being valid. So it's got a valid structure. And that means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows rationally from those premises. So the premises are true, we sort of got to accept the conclusion. The question is whether or not the premises are true. And so, you might pause and think to yourself for a second, do I think these premises are true? If there's a problem with this argument, what is it? Well, there are a couple objections to this argument. One of them is that the first premise is false. The thought here is that some humans presumably have moral rights, even though they lack the capacity to participate in these collective decision-making processes. Consider, again, people who are severely mentally disabled. They might not have the power to engage or participate in some sort of collective decision-making process, and yet we think they still have rights. We still need to respect them. We can't ignore their interests just because they can't participate in these decision-making processes. So that's a problem for this contractarian argument. It seems like some things deserve rights even if they can't sort of form any agreements. But another objection is that the other premise is false too, that humans aren't the only things with the capacity to participate in these collective decision-making processes. If there are intelligent aliens out there, then they could presumably participate in these decision-making processes as well. So humans don't seem like we all have the ability to do this, and it seems like we're not the only people who have the ability to do it. So if we think that like the ability to participate in these collective decision-making processes is the thing that's morally relevant, then it doesn't seem to support anthropocentrism, the view that humans are the only things that deserve direct moral consideration. Another kind of attraction or like way to approach this anthropocentrist view is via a kind of Christian argument. So the thought here in this argument is that whether or not a being is directly morally considerable depends on whether or not they're made in God's image. So a being like needs to be made in God's image in order for it to be directly morally considerable. And then the second premise of the argument is that humans are the only beings who are made in God's image. And the conclusion then is that humans are the only beings who are directly morally considerable. This is maybe a version of it's criticized, the argument is for like strong anthropocentrism, where only humans have direct moral consideration. Again, you could pause the video and sort of think about, do I think these premises are true? Personally, I guess I'm hesitant to say for sure whether I think 1 or 2 are true or false, but I think there's either way, there's still an objection lingering in the background. And that's that the argument itself doesn't really tell us what it means to be made in God's image. So what does it mean? Maybe it means to have free will, to be creative, to be intelligent. I'm not sure. It's a little bit vague, right? What counts as being made in God's image? But the thought is, I think this is from like the opponent of the argument, whatever it is, whatever you say is the thing that makes us made in God's image, then presumably it's that thing that makes beings directly morally considerable or not. So this like God's image language is just a stand-in for the thing that really matters. Maybe that's, again, intelligence or creativity or free will or something along those lines. But if that's true, then like the sort of being made in God's image isn't really like doing any work in the argument. It's like we need to figure out what that other feature would be. And is that feature that all humans have? Is it something that that even if all and only humans have it, that makes things have additional value? That's unclear. All right. So we've seen some different bases on which people might try to establish that humans are the only things that are directly morally considerable, or some bases, some arguments for thinking that humans have more inherent value than other things. Now we want to look at what might seem to be a problem or the central problem with anthropocentrism. And here we go. So and this might be like widely plausible, humans have this kind of special value. There's something special about humans. I think we should all accept that. The problem is that it's not clear that they have special inherent value or intrinsic value, right? Maybe it's what makes humans especially valuable is that we're especially instrumentally valuable. But even if we grant that humans do have a special kind of inherent value, it's almost certainly not the fact that we're human, like the fact that we have human DNA. That doesn't seem to be the thing that makes us especially valuable. Maybe, well, we'll see some examples next time that maybe challenge this. So the claim, and this is a claim that anthropocentrism is making, that humans are especially inherently valuable because they're human, seems to be a speciesist claim. Now, what is speciesism? Speciesism is a kind of analogy to racism or sexism. So a theory, we would call a theory racist if it discriminates in favor of certain beings on account of their race. So beings that have a certain race are more valuable than beings that don't have that race. A theory is sexist if it discriminates against certain beings or in favor of or against certain beings simply on the basis of their sex. So these theories are both bad, right? Racism is wrong, sexism is wrong. We shouldn't discriminate against beings simply because of this factor like race or sex. It doesn't make someone better or worse, more or less valuable. So what makes them bad is that they're giving moral relevance to some morally irrelevant property. Speciesism is kind of the same idea. A theory is speciesist if it discriminates in favor of certain beings, like humans, simply based on their species membership, whatever species they belong to. And the thought is like, this is wrong in the same way that racism and sexism are wrong. Now, this is controversial, right? Like, I think most people in our society are speciesist. So in the same way, right, that in the past, a lot of members of our society were racist, or a lot of people in our society were sexist. So the people giving this objection are saying like, something's wrong with our society still. We're speciesist. We're giving this morally irrelevant feature, species membership, special fancy moral weight when in fact we shouldn't be. If species membership is morally relevant, right, just like race or sex, then speciesism is just as bad as racism and sexism because it's leading us to make bad moral decisions. So for those who think that humans are especially inherently valuable, so I think it's strong anthropocentrism is going to be hard to defend. It's pretty implausible that humans are the only things that have direct moral considerability. This maybe we'll see more next time, or might be obvious to you already. But if you think, no, humans, maybe we're not the only things, but we do have a kind of special inherent value, the solution, I think, is to move away from a biology-based account of inherent value, like anthropocentrism, that's what anthropocentrism is, and towards a capacities-based account of inherent value. So, like, what makes us special isn't something about our biological makeup, but rather what's special about us is something like the capacities that we have, like our ability to reason. That makes us distinct from other animals. That's a more plausible view or a more plausible route to go. So we want to reject anthropocentrism, even if we think there's something special about humans. Seems like we need to reject anthropocentrism and maybe move to something like ratiocentrism. All right, that is the end of our lesson for today. So for next time, you're going to read some of the examples in box 5.2, and there's a reading quiz over some of those thought experiments. So think about those thought experiments, and then when we meet next time in the next lesson, we're going to talk about what we should make of those thought experiments or what they teach us. All right, have a good one.